welcome to the 38th Radio VR live panel from our studio here in Moscow, Russia. Our topic for tonight is Sochi coverage, a U-turn for the Western press. And joining us live in the studio is Robert Bridge, a former editor-in-chief of Moscow News. Howdy.
Hello.
We have our guest in Washington, Amos Gelb, who's the director of broadcast at the Medill School of Journalism. Welcome to the show, Amos.
Good to be here.
And broadcasting in our studio in London, we have Alexander Mercouris, a legal expert and a media analyst. Welcome to the show, Alexander.
Hello.
Now, gentlemen, I'd like to read some text, and then we'll ask some questions afterwards, and we'll discuss. Very easy format. And the first topic that I'd like to discuss, actually, Sochi Olympics, very easy. That's why we're all here. We have, from the moment the Russian city of Sochi was chosen as the host city for the 2014 Olympic Games, Western media has viewed this event as something it was not. In the very best cases, a few in the media have portrayed the Games as being a test for Russian President Vladimir Putin, while the majority of journalists has viewed it as an ideological battleground where Russia and the West would go toe-to-toe, or so one might conclude from the headlines. But I'd really like to look at some of the myths surrounding Sochi, first of all. And one of the myths, actually, that I see quite often is just the general text, the way that it's portrayed. For instance, if you pick up any newspaper, regarding the Olympics, we can pretty much almost always see any article start with the same words. Those words are, they don't have to be in this order exactly, but we can read Sochi, corruption, most expensive ever, $50 billion price tag. But the question is this even true? So, for starters, in an interview with CNBC approximately a day ago, which was buried deep on their website, Russian businessman Oleg Deripaska, one of the oligarchs, so to speak, so I believe he knows a thing or two about business, and he said that the $50 billion price tag on this event was not true at all. He said it was completely made up. He went on to say that the true cost was somewhere between $27 and $29 billion. And taking another look at this statement, the Washington Post a day later noted that Dmitry Kozyak, the deputy prime minister who headed Russia's Olympic Preparatory Commission, had said 1 year ago that Russia would spend more than $6.5 billion on Olympic facilities, more than $16.5 billion on upgrading infrastructure, such as railroads, roads, and other things like bridges and tunnels around Sochi. And in fact, now, there's a brand new 50-kilometer road, combined motorway and railway running through the mountains, which includes 12 tunnels, 29 kilometers in total, 45 bridges, and 4 different train stations. The article goes on to note that this cost roughly $23.5 billion in total with the infrastructure plus the $6.5 billion that they were going to invest. And then the rest of the money that was spent was private, speculative money coming from private sponsors building hotels and businessmen that were making a quick buck from tourists. And in fact, not all of the money that was even included in this sum of $50 billion was even related to the Olympics, as the article notes that there's a $350 million F1 racetrack that was also built as part of this Sochi project. And let's not forget that Sochi is a small city. 7 years ago, a city of 350,000 people without five-star hotels or other facilities that were required to host a world-class event. Now it's on par with any major city across the world.
Sure. Yes.
Now, here's the question. People who accuse the Western media's critics of having a weak spot for conspiracy theories might cite other examples of negative coverage ahead of major events. For example, the 2011 World Cup in South Africa was preceded by several months of negative coverage when changed for the better, only when teams started to actually kick the ball around and the games began. But still, the barrage that Russia had to endure before Sochi was unprecedented, and it went far beyond what China had to go through before its recent Olympic Games. I have a very simple question. Why? Robert?
Well, as you say, Jeremy, it's definitely unprecedented in the scale of the negative media coverage. It's been unbelievable. It's gotten to the point where myself personally, I stopped reading the coverage in the media. It's just been borderline depressing. And I think there are different things that you can point to. I think the main thing is that everybody keeps talking about that this is the so-called Putin Olympics. First time I think that any president has had I don't know what you could call it, the honor of having the Olympic Games named after him, but that's basically what it's come down to. It's been politicized to such a degree that it's quite disturbing, and you could point to different reasons why that is so. You have the situation in Syria where Putin stepped in and he basically stopped what was pretty much a preordained American attack on Syria. He stepped in with his peace plan, and that certainly upset a lot of people in Washington. And second of all, you have Edward Snowden, of course, now he's sitting in Moscow comfortably with his political asylum. So that's also another factor in the negative publicity.
Well, definitely. And on many accounts, many political analysts say that Russia won on all foreign policy issues last year. We will come back to this topic a little bit later on the show.
Okay.
Over to you, Washington. Amos, why?
First of all, it may be unprecedented in some of the tone, but it's not unprecedented in the coverage. You forget about the Salt Lake City Olympics, where the charges of corruption were not only in the media all the time. It was the one defining story. What was interesting was that
you're talking about Mitt Romney and his buddies?
Talking about Mitt Romney and his buddies. And there were actually some court cases. There were criminal charges filed. People were cleared. But the question of Olympics and the disasters coming for it have sort of have to date it back to Montreal, where Montreal, which is still paying for its for the Olympic Games, it's still in debt. Every year, this whole story of is it going to be a disaster? Don't forget, Mitt Romney made a big deal in London before the London Olympics, which had all the facilities made, when he essentially said, yeah, they're not going to be able to do it very well, and caused a huge ruckus. Take a look at Brazil. Now, every country thinks it's unfair, and it's being targeted. But, it's sort of like the plane crash, right? Will the plane crash? The fact that it lands safely, and as it appears, the biggest problem seems to be at the moment, the weather out there. The stories after the initial stories of some of the problems in the facilities that some of the people clearly did have. I think the crying unfairly that Russia is being singled out, maybe you could argue with the tone, but I think you'd be wrong to say it's the first time. By the way, for that point, when I was at CNN, we did a very thorough investigation of the Atlanta Olympics, which, by the way, was thoroughly corrupt. And I was at CNN, and the story got killed because Ted Turner had people on the board, on the organizing committee. So, again, I would caution that this is not the first nor the most egregious.
Interesting point on Atlanta. I hadn't heard that a story had been killed.
No, me.
But over to London now. Alexander?
Yeah, well, can I just say a few things about this? I mean, I've experienced two recent Olympics quite close up. One was in Athens, which is the city where I was born and where I have family. One was in London. Now, there has been absolutely no comparison, in my opinion, between the kind of criticisms that the Olympics in Athens or London or indeed Beijing or Salt Lake City or elsewhere got and those in Sochi. Sochi has been on an entirely different scale, and more importantly, there's been a very strong political agenda behind all of this. We've seen European and American leaders, for example, refusing to go there, and all sorts of things being said, some of which we're no doubt going to discuss. Now, on the subject of the money that's been spent in relation to Sochi, I think a point to make is that a lot of this money was spent in order not just to develop Sochi, but as a boost for the local economy in an area, the Northern Caucasus, which has been extremely run down, where there's high unemployment, and where there's been recently a history, as we all know, of war. The whole point about the Olympic Games, one of the points about the Olympic Games, was to boost the economy and the infrastructure in this area. So the fact that the Russian government and Russia was going to spend a lot of money on Sochi was something that everybody knew in advance. This figure of $50 billion that comes up, and if I may say, if you watch the BBC coverage of the opening ceremony, they were repeating it almost incessantly, is one that actually comes from a Russian opposition leader, Mr. Boris Nemtsov, who did a report on the Sochi Games, which has been, I think, largely discredited. The point is, that figure is a perfect figure, and people have been recycling it continuously. However often it has been proved that it is not actually correct.
Well, interesting point that you have on Nemtsov, and actually he is one of the opposition members. The other person, of course, is Navalny, and both of them together have been repeating this to really anybody that would listen. And you really have to ask yourself why they would do that, and that's a completely different topic that we'll get into in another show. I have another question for you, Amos. This is just a side question. It's a little bit aggressive, but I would still like to throw it out there. Recently, America had the Super Bowl, which is the championship game for the NFL which is the National Football League. And the event is so popular that it's the most watched sporting event in America, and a ticket for one seat starts at several $1,000s. So this is a major event. We're talking billions of dollars in this for this sport, for one game. One game, really. Yeah. Now, the New York Jersey state government and the NFL, a billion-dollar organization, had 3 years to prepare for this event. Yet on game day, it failed miserably. Worse than that, it left tens of thousands of guests stranded. They had touted this event for people to take the mass transportation, take mass transport, leave your cars in New York, leave your cars somewhere else, get everybody out to Jersey, to MetLife Stadium.
Right.
But on game day, it turned out that it broke down, and they left tens of thousands of fans still stranded in the bitter cold, not only before the game, but after the game as well. Now, Amos, if this had happened here in Russia at the Olympics, what would the American journalists have written?
Oh, they would have been all over it, like they were all over the Atlanta Games. The Atlanta Games failed disastrously in its transportation, so much so that one team actually hijacked a bus to get it to its event on time. No, there would have been a huge outcry. I understand the desire to cry foul on this. And if you notice that actually the coverage for the last few days has been tampered down, aside from complaints about the conditions up at the mountain, and then the question is, why would the Olympic Committee, not why would Russia want to have it, but why would the Olympic Committee agree to have games in a subtropical climate where it's known to get warm like this? So the questions on the conditions, what's interesting is that while the athletes some of the Americans who have not won have said the conditions aren't great, they've all said, we're all we're all skiing on the same pipe. So yeah, look, the thing is, you're talking about media. Let's be very clear. There was a major concern before. You mentioned people not coming, people not going. There was a major concern before because of the bombs, the bomb threats, the security, which was promoted by the Russians saying how secure it was going to be. And then the live threats were going to bomb the hell out of this place by the terrorists, a couple of whom seem to no longer be with us, thanks to the Russian security forces. That was a legitimate concern. There has been no comments about the security. It seems to be going fine. There were comments at the beginning about in the same way there are about Brazil, that the facilities weren't ready. And a number of the reporters got to places where they checked into how would you feel if you being sent on a business trip to Washington, you walked into a hotel room and there was a stray dog who'd taken up residence, as happened to one journalist.
Amos, I'm glad you brought that up. And in fact, that leads into my second question here. And in the days leading up to the opening event, journalists flooded the social networking spheres with pictures that may or may not have been taken in Sochi, and that really shocked the rest of the world. Everybody saw this BuzzFeed. Everybody saw these great GIFs, great pictures on Twitter, and then they were great pictures. But the only problem was that some of them were fabricated, and the question really is why. And it also seemed that as if it was a game that Western journalists and sometimes the athletes themselves were playing. And that game was who could create the most outlandish story that went viral. And while some of the stories were probably true, the motives of others really have to be questioned. But why? Why should we question them? And it seems that the answer was revealed in a USA Today article that noted that for athletes, the Olympic Games were a way to raise their profiles. That seems pretty clear-cut. But there were two ways to do this. And American alpine skier Michaela Schifrin said that this is a great opportunity to build my legacy and build my brand. Of course, one way is to do that by winning, and the other way is to do that is to become an internet sensation. As an example of this, Johnny Quinn, who was an anonymous American bobsledder. Nobody knew who this guy was. But after he posted a picture on Twitter of where he supposedly punched through a door because he was locked in, and the door was destroyed. I mean, I was like, wow, that guy just... wow, Well, suddenly he became famous. He couldn't get enough interviews, and in fact...
I think he would have been arrested but anyways, America for that stunt, but anyway.
Well, and now he can expect endorsements, where basically translates to cash money for his pocket once he returns to the United States. Maybe he'll get an energy drink endorsement. But he even tried to do it a second time, where he was supposedly trapped in an elevator, and a teammate of his live tweeted the event. It didn't work out as well this time. Medill's a little harder than doors. But and who else remembers the Western journalist that showed how quickly hackers had hacked his computer, and how dangerous that it was in Sochi, except that he wasn't in Sochi, and that he himself had instigated the attack by clicking on a known pirate website. So my question is, gentlemen, is that there's an old saying in journalism, if it leads, it bleeds. And with this in mind, is
Okay.
Sochi a victim of today's technology, or are the derogative social posts a clever new way of seizing the spotlight and becoming rich and famous? Amos, to you.
First of all, I'm going to say, while all of these are certainly may certainly have happened. I remember the hacking story. It came and went. All of these, you're picking up a couple of instances. Yeah, the guy breaking down the door and the Twitter. It was a great picture, and oh my God, look, he walked through the door, and wow, he punched the door. These are anecdotes, individual stories, which I would say are not defining the coverage. There's certainly things that are very annoying for the authorities and clearly for you to see and to read. But I would not say they define the coverage. The defining of the coverage is now the amazing feats of these athletes, the ridiculous nature of the slope side snowboarding when they're like 100 feet in the air doing spins. It's the women ski jumpers proving the sexism of all the years down to be ridiculous. It is these people on luges going 80 miles an hour on ice. You've got a few stories, but a lot of that stuff was sort of preamble. Yes, social media, huge factor. Nobody knows how to really do it. Everybody's trying to do it. But I think I actually think the coverage, now the games have been going on, have moved on. There was a story in the beginning about transportation delays and how rough it was. One story, apparently, there was a problem on the first day. Haven't heard anything more than that.
Amos, you're absolutely right. That's why we have the theme for this discussion as a U-turn for the Western press. It started off. There were 5 days of bad coverage. All of a sudden, we got these great stories on Twitter and social media. Now, of course, things are better. But over to you, Alexander.
I completely agree with what Amos said. I think there was an attempt actually to define the story around, missing doorknobs and all the rest. It all simply collapsed the moment the opening ceremony happened and the sports events took place. After that, nobody was interested, frankly, in stories about doorknobs, crumbling doors and all the rest.
Well, I agree with you as well, but you also touched upon a subject that I'd like to bring up just a little bit later. So we'll go back to that. Robert?
Okay, I think you two gentlemen are completely deceiving yourselves. All due respect. What they did before the games was, in my opinion, the worst form of poor sportsmanship you could possibly get. And the reason for this is because the people were planning, anybody who was planning on coming to Sochi, I don't know what the percentage is, but you read this type of coverage that the Western media was throwing at Russia, okay? Totally negative, totally uncalled for, non-stop about the gay ban. Nobody's talked about that yet, which is totally a misnomer. It has nothing to do against banning gays. Gays are welcome here.
We'll come back to that in a minute.
We'll come back to that, but this just leads up to the whole thing here, okay? It goes from the more serious charges of terrorism, which they didn't stop talking about, and to the less serious charges of, poor hotel rooms and the dirty water in the hotel rooms, which is a natural thing to happen at a construction site.
Actually,
this place is brand new. These things are going to happen. The kinks need some time to work out. Now, there are so many people who probably, like I said, I don't know what the numbers are, but how many people canceled their tickets to come to Sochi because of this ridiculous, one-sided type of journalism that's totally biased, and they're basically pushing a pro-Western agenda that wants to continue this argument, this illogical argument that Russia is somehow backwards, that it's still a Soviet state. They don't want Western audiences to see the reality. So they had to continue pumping this type of a story. Okay, so fine. The Western media has done a U-turn. Very good. But how long were they on this highway to hell on Russia in Sochi? How long were they on that? And how long did that have to go on before the majority of people just said, sorry, I'm going to cancel my flight. I'm not going to Sochi. They just joined the Western leaders. How many Western leaders backed out of this? Every single one of them. So they just followed in the footsteps of those people, tails between their legs, as if terrorism doesn't happen anywhere else. As if people don't get locked in their bathroom door somewhere else. This happens everywhere. So where in the hell, I'm sorry, excuse my French, but where in the hell does this type of behavior and attitude in journalism come into this? It doesn't. It seeps in through the sewer water that you claim is coming into the hotel rooms in Sochi, which I can tell you for a fact it isn't. And the hotel rooms are a hell of a lot stronger than what they portrayed in that tweet. Excuse me.
Can I just say something about that? You see, I to some extent, agree with Robert. My simple point, the point I was making was, yes, that was the attempt to define the story. The attempt to define the story by talking up missing doorknobs, all the rest, bad toilets, double toilets, all that nonsense. The moment the actual game started, however, that became unsustainable because what people saw was something completely different.
Okay, may I interrupt you for 1 second? May I?
Yes?
Yeah.
Unsustainable. Fine. But like I said before, I mean, all due respect to your opinion, but, okay, the argument is no longer sustainable. It's just like Iraq. Okay, the argument is no longer sustainable that they went in there and bombed them, okay, and oops, there's no more weapons. I mean, it's a long leap of logic here, okay? But basically, the damage has been done. The Western media has really seriously, I mean, the games will go on, and I think they'll be a success, as they are. I mean, the opening ceremony was one of the greatest of all time. China spent $40 billion on their opening ceremony. So, you know, give it some inflation.
Let me chime in. To transition to what you were talking about on the bigger stage. Don't forget that you cannot take this story out of the context. The context of China was indeed the crushing of civil rights of the people that happened with clearing out whole neighborhoods in Beijing. Lived in Beijing. I know what happened and where it happened. And the story was a lot of things that preceded it, and the crushing of the media. Even the journalists were not allowed to report the stuff. All of that happened again. The comment that there's more of it, well, there's more media on everything. So I think one thing you're seeing here is more outlets, more ways of information getting out. The second part of it is, yes, terrorism is a huge issue. It's an issue, a visceral issue that still haunts America. It's a visceral issue after the Al-Qaeda attacks, continuing attacks. And to be honest, if you had this in St. Petersburg, or if the games have happened in Moscow, if the games had happened any place other than within the area, and by the way, 400 miles, I think that distance is, that's still quite a distance away, and it's a completely different animal. But there is a geographic perception that there has been issues in Chechnya. They have spread to Dagestan and to other areas down there. And the concern is real, not just for foreigners, but also for Russians. Okay, and
let's move on with a second, guys. Most foreign policy analysts noted that last year Russia had won on most of its foreign policy objectives, so much so that apparently Western media was forced to change tactics and actually invent a problem, and that problem would be gay rights, of course. And with this in mind, the issue of gay rights took center stage, and this was one of the three-pronged attack on Russia regarding the Olympics. Fast forward to the Olympics in Sochi, and reporters there discovered that Sochi, despite what the mayor said publicly, actually has one gay club, and it's called Mayak, or Lighthouse, and it's located behind an unmarked door right off one of the city's main drags. So it's there if people there know about it. In fact, since the Olympic Games are in full swing, Mayak has been visited by hundreds of foreign journalists that are eager to find local gays that now live in fear because Russia has passed a law banning gay propaganda among minors, and as everyone in the West wrongly believes, and it's now internationally known, Russia's now internationally known for hating gays. In an interview, the owner of Mayak actually said that the law hasn't affected the 10-year-old club in any way. And specifically, he noted that the law applies to propaganda among minors. But we've never let people in here under the age of 21. So it didn't affect them because the local law stipulates that minors have a curfew. In fact, he went on to say the business was better than ever. And numerous articles went on to note that gays in Sochi have been given hundreds of interviews. They're trying to find some case, some celebrity that can step forward, but the media hasn't been able to. And in fact, quoting one source, the gays have said nobody bothers us, so we don't bother anybody else. In a strange twist, a journalist from the New Republic actually wrote this article, and she said that, and she seemed almost let down when she wrote it. She said the only people who are bothering gays in Sochi, it seems, were the foreign journalists, pointing cameras in their faces, asking questions, and ruining their night out. So the question that I have for you gentlemen is this: do journalists have an agenda that they wish to promote at all costs, whether the facts paint a different picture from the one they wish to portray it? Amos.
Okay, let me head everybody off here who agree completely with you guys that this thing is a classic case of journalistic mismanagement. But let me give the context of it here. America is being swept. We're having a cultural revolution here. Gay marriage, back and forth, is going on across the country. So any comment about civil rights, gays, supposed right or wrong, is going to be shaped by that. Then you have a series of African countries passing laws that are what everybody is possibly misstating the Russian law as being. They are purely, totally, we're talking about jail sentences and execution for gays. Here's the thing. I think if you asked 99, maybe 100% of Americans what the Russian law is or what it said, they couldn't tell you. To be honest, I don't know the details of it. So my comment to this is that this is not really a story about Russia. This is a story about America dealing with this cultural revolution that is happening, and it is bleeding over because for whatever reason, it got some notice at the beginning, and then nobody's really done enough homework to do that. And while it sounds like it's aimed at Russia, it's really about a conversation happening here.
Are you suggesting this is a domestic story that's being projected onto international relations then?
That's exactly what I would argue it is. And I would argue that and also if you didn't have the African countries putting out really villainous laws about this, then I would also argue that it's not there. So this is one where you got to take it out of the context. And then again, there is a spotlight on Russia right now. There's the Olympics. So 99% of the time, this wouldn't even make the paper. But there is a hyper focus on Russia. And you're right. And for all those, to preempt your guests there, who are going to come out swinging about how inappropriate this is for the U.S., you're right. It's been a footnote, but it's sort of nobody's done the homework to understand what it is. And this is, uninformed conversations being had on this right now.
Alexander?
Well, can I just say, first of all, that the law bears absolutely no relation to what many people in the United States say that it is. I find it very difficult to believe, given that this is a very short law, just a few sentences, that people in the United States, in these vast media organizations that exist there, cannot familiarize themselves with it. Briefly, it is an amendment to a law that regulates information that is provided in the news media. That's basically what it is. There's minor fines of around $100 to people who also say certain things to children in words. But essentially, it is an amendment to a media law, and that's all it is. It does not do 99.9% of the things people say it does, and it was never intended to. Now, I find it very difficult to believe that this campaign that has existed is incidentally about Russia and principally about the United States. The focus on Russia and on what's happened in Russia and what's going on in Russia has been absolutely unrelenting on this issue. And I think, frankly, that it is complacent to think that it is not about Russia. To my mind, it most obviously is. And given the way the law gets consistently misrepresented, one has to be, frankly, concerned about that.
Mr. Bridge?
Yeah, I would have to agree with what you said there. I would disagree slightly with you, Amos, on the fact that what you say is the cultural revolution of gay marriages sweeping America. In fact, only 11 states now legally recognize gay marriages. Okay, so that's hardly a cultural revolution. That's less than 30% of U.S. states that want to see this sort of cultural revolution in their country. And I think that, as you said, American journalists, well, not just American journalists, this isn't an American thing, it's a Western thing, that they do need to do their homework if they're going to be putting out particular remarks. The so-called gay ban, it's not a gay ban. It's aimed for children. It's made for children. Okay, and I think that most Americans, coming after the Miley Cyrus performances and things like this, where people are twerking their butts in people's faces, I think a lot of Americans would applaud this type of a law that puts some kind of a cap on, well, if the situation was reversed, Hollywood's dissemination
of minors.
Yes, I mean it's ridiculous, and I mean, a lot of Americans are sick of it, but they don't have any control over their system to change it. Actually, Russia's law is much more in sync with the way Americans think about this subject. We don't like seeing this all this, sex in children's face. Why are they teaching children at 5 years old sex education? They don't need to be thinking about these things. Of course, it's an important issue, but there's a time and a place for this.
I'm going to have to step in there.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I step in is that I have your opinion is fine, but I cannot let in and say that you say most Americans feel this way.
Well, the law speaks for itself, I believe. 30%, less than 30%, well less than 30%. 11 states only agree with this.
Gentlemen, we have approximately 2 minutes left. Amos?
again, this is, I understand the vitriol and I understand the unfairness, and there's definitely a thought of malice aforethought. I don't believe that there has been such malice aforethought. I think, first of all, we can have a discussion about gay marriage and how it is affecting it, but that's a different thing. What I'm saying, my argument to you is that this is the comment of, in the run-up to the story, this is what has happened before. There is more media than ever before. More people looking for stories. The athletes could never tweet. They could never do this stuff. Ascribing what an athlete might say as somehow being the media and journalist is conflating different issues. Yeah, there are problems. Here's the thing that I think you have to consider. Sochi Games are over. The thing that we will be talking about next is not about how unfair the American media is. The odd comment will be next is, why isn't the American media paying any attention to Russia? That is going to be the next one to come. So it's a spotlight. Spotlight isn't always pretty.
Over to you, Alexander. We have about 20 seconds left for your response.
Very briefly, I think that anybody reading the commentary and reading some of the things that were said and written in the United States who thinks this is not about Russia, it is simply not reading it properly. It obviously is about Russia. It obviously goes on and on about Mr. Putin, about the church there, about all sorts of things. And the impression that has been given is that Russia is a violently homophobic country in which gays are in a state of terror, and that there was supposed to be a boycott. There was a campaign to boycott the Sochi Olympics over this. And it's impossible for me to see that this is not indeed about Russia. Now, America has its culture wars. I don't know what the state of opinion in America is.
Unfortunately, Alexander, we're running out of time here. I'd like to remind everybody that the topic of our discussion was Sochi coverage, a U-turn for the Western press. Joining us was Robert Bridge, a former editor-in-chief of Moscow News. Our guest in Washington was Amos Gelb, director of broadcast at Medill School of Journalism. And in London, we had Alexander Mercouris, legal expert and a media analyst. My name is Jay Johnson. Stay tuned to Radio VR.